Welcome those. Today is December 15th, the Ides of December. It's Nero's birthday today, so we will have a violinist in church today and start something on fire just for fun. I'm kidding. He was born in this date in 37 A.D. He's one of the Romans that is, I don't given credit. I don't know if right is the right word, for being there when Paul showed up in Rome. But that was on this date. In 1727, Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who is now a Moravian bishop, ordained Peter Böhler as a missionary. I know, thinking, wow, I was wondering when that happened. Who's Peter Böhler? Who's Count von Zinzendorf? I always like to name Zinzendorf. There's a couple of them in biblical history, and if we'd had a third son, he would have been named Zinzendorf. But Peter Böhler is a Moravian missionary who came to the United States in the early 1700s, and his claim to fame, I guess if you want to call it that, was he met John and Charles Wesley on the boat. And if you ever read the story of the Wesleys, as they came over, they met with Moravian missionaries, and it kind of changed their approach to ministry. And after 2 miserable years in England or in Georgia, the Wesleys went back to the U.S. or to England. Today is Edward Cole's birthday, born on this date in 1786. Illinois' second governor. Yes, I know what you're wondering. Bond, Shadrach Bond. That's our first governor. Just so you know. Gustav Eiffel was born on this day. The one who designed the Eiffel Tower. And lastly, today it's the day that Sarah Doudney died. Sarah Doudney died on this date in 1926. She was a hymn writer, best known for her hymn, "The Master Hath Come, and He calls us to follow the paths of His footsteps. He leads on our way." She didn't write the tune, but she wrote the music or the words. "The Master Hath Come." But that was on this date in 1926 was when she died. So, all right. Okay, if you have your Bible, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Today we are going to be talking about two events. That's the goal at least. We're going to be talking about David and Goliath, or actually David and Saul and Goliath. 1 Samuel 16 and 17 today. Okay, so now we're going to see David start getting into action. Last week we talked about his being anointed, and remember he was anointed by Samuel in the presence of his brothers, of whom he has 7, and his father, of whom he has 1. Okay, there's a sister or 2 in there, but we'll talk about that. Not the sister, but we'll talk about the brothers in a minute when we get down there. So it says at the end of 16, verse 13, so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah, which is to say Samuel went home. Samuel went home. Maybe he's sitting there thinking to himself, my work here is done, although he's had that feeling before, I think. So, but it says here that the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, which is kind of interesting because that's the same thing that was said about Saul in chapter 10, verse 6. Samuel says to Saul, you do this, and I'm going to anoint you, then you're going to go down this hill, and 3 things are going to happen to you, and after the third thing, this is going to be important, the third thing, you remember in chapter 10, that Saul was going to meet up with a group of prophets, and he was going to fall in with that group, and they were going to start ministering together, prophesying together, and we're trying to figure out what is that they were talking about, and clearly they're talking about making music of some sort, singing, because there are instruments involved. And so we know that Saul is somebody who is musical in some way or another. Okay, so hold that thought. That's going to come back here. It's interesting. It says now at the end of verse 13 there, so the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, and then in verse 14, now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. Maybe the Spirit of the Lord at that time only wanted to be in one king at a time. I suppose that, I don't know. But it says the same spirit on your handout, the same spirit that had departed from Saul to be replaced by what? An evil spirit. And an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Now, no, this is not the same thing. It's an evil spirit. I mean, it was the spirit of the Lord to be replaced by an evil spirit from the Lord. It's interesting, if you look in 1 Kings 22, I'll turn there. There's a story talking about, let's see, I'll just read it to you. So we don't have a really good explanation here. Does the Lord have a cadre of evil spirits that he sends? Is it just that he left the void and the evil spirit came in? Now, the writer of that time would have seen everything as being caused by God. So it's like, well, if spirit it's an evil spirit, it had to be from God. In let's see, 1 Kings 22, what was my verse here? 22 verses 18 through 23. This is a story about Ahab, and this is one of my, I kind of like Ahab, just as a, he's a bad king. He was an evil king. But he, just some of the things he said were funny. But the king of Israel says to Jehoshaphat, didn't I tell you, he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad. So he just, just one of these guys who just says, hey, I don't like him because he never says anything good about me. Micaiah continued, therefore hear the word of the Lord. So the Micaiah is a prophet. He's speaking to King Ahab, and he says, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all of the multitudes of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth-Gilead and going to his death there? One suggested this and another that. Finally, a spirit came forward before the Lord and said, I will entice him. By what means? The Lord asked. I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouths of the prophets. You will succeed in enticing him, said the Lord. Go and do it. Is it something like that? Perhaps. There's we have nowhere near the time to go into it, but if you look at the story of Job, one approach to looking at how is Satan in heaven, this is one of the big questions. How can Satan be in heaven? Well, one way to look at this is to say that wasn't Satan. That was an angel called the accuser, the Ha-Satan. And it's only later that we read back that it's Satan in there. And this accuser was somebody who was sort of like the prosecutor, somebody who was paid to go out and, try people. One way to look at it. So is it something like that? Regardless, how the evil spirit got there, we don't know. Whether Satan has invaded, whether it's a bad mood, whether it's just he's bipolar, looking at it from a modern perspective, we don't really know. But clearly something has changed with Saul. So the evil spirit from the Lord. That's where I say, wait, what? How, this is always, but again, the difference is the spirit of the Lord had left him, and the evil spirit is from the Lord. So it's not that the Lord has an evil side here, okay? So Saul's attendants know that music will soothe him, so they make a suggestion. Music hath souls to soothe this, hath charms to soothe the savage beast, something like that. Saul's attendants said to him, see, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. Okay, that would be like a harp, an instrument. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better. Okay, so again, music. So and it's well known in the universe that sometimes, and how many of you, if you're stressed or something, there's a certain type of music that you can put on that will calm you down. Well, Ed maybe, I don't know, but no, I'm just, that there's a certain type of music that can calm you down, okay? And they have this suggestion. Now, I think, this is just my opinion, that whoever is making this suggestion is already planning on bringing David in, okay? That's my thinking, okay? But he says, he will play when the evil spirit comes on you, and he will feel better. So Saul said to his attendants, find someone who plays well and bring him to me. Okay. So one of the servants answered. So basically the servant says, I know a guy. I got a guy. And let's listen to this description of David here. So you're looking for somebody who can play an instrument, right? That's the qualification. That's what you need. Okay. Now here's how he sells him. So I have seen a son of Jesse in Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. Okay. All right. There, you're done. That's all you need, right? But he is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. Okay. And so the servant knows the guy. He describes him as a son of Jesse, knows how to play the lyre, a brave man, a warrior, well-spoken, and good-looking. Okay, just kind of how most people describe Ed. Okay, but it's oversell perhaps, or does this guy really want David to get this gig? Okay, I think the guy's
just simply looking for not just any lyre player, but an exemplary person.
He certainly has one. Right. Although why being a warrior matters, but here's the thing. So the question is, how does this guy know? I mean, how do they know David is a warrior? Okay, hold that thought. We're going to get back to that in a minute. Okay, so one of the servants, I know this guy. Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." Okay, Saul sends for David. Now, again, this is a question based on the argument of the silence of Scripture, on something that's not there. How does Saul know his name? How does Saul know he's with the sheep? Okay, maybe because this guy would have given more information, but it's a question because how does he know these things? I'll just leave it at that. Okay, Saul sent messengers. So Jesse, the father, takes a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. So Jesse loads up David with supplies and sends him off. Okay, good idea? Yes? No? Maybe? Well, I mean, he doesn't have a whole lot of choice. Okay, the king has said, but Jesse knows something about David that apparently Saul doesn't know yet. And what would that be? That David has been anointed king. So is it really a good idea to say, sure, go sit in a room with the king here, who is known to be having a little trouble mentally? Go ahead. Good idea. I'm in the maybe camp. I don't think Jesse is super excited about this idea, but does he have a whole lot of choice? He doesn't. So he sends David into kingdom, and David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Okay, if you remember the story back in chapter 14, that the armor bearer is somebody who carries the armor, carries the weapons. In chapter 14, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer that go over the hill with the crazy ideas of, hey, we're just going to walk into the middle of a Philistine camp. They're going to know we're coming. And if the Lord is with us, we're going to win. And guess what? The Lord was with them. They won. Okay? They had a great thing. But that's kind of what the armor bearer does. So he became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Okay. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Okay. So David is there in Saul's service. He's playing a lyre. Okay. Now so he's pretty close, right? I mean, he's playing this harp, and you kind of have to be kind of close to be able to hear the music in such a way that it's going to, affect you. So he's kind of close. He's one of his armor bearers. Saul knows all about him. There's all kinds of information here that Saul has got a not great new guy in service, right? So everything's good, right? Everything's fine. Saul's there. And whenever he feels bad, he just calls David, come on out, plays his instrument. He goes. He knows who David is. He knows who David's family is. What's not to like? Well, let's go to chapter 17. Any questions so far? All right. Yes? No? Okay, good. Chapter 17. Let me see. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. Let me make sure I've got Jesse loads up David with supplies and sends them off. Good idea. I say maybe. Saul likes David very much, and David becomes an armor bearer. David becomes a permanent presence at the palace, pleasing for Saul. Okay, and Saul's kingdom was marked by constant war with the Philistines. Okay, remember that at the end of chapter 15, constant war with the Philistines. And here we are again. Oh, I forgot our rocks. Debbie knows what I'm talking, right? Yeah. So now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled a Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley in between them. Okay, so this pretty much sets the stage. You've got these two hills that are kind of around, and then there's this plain in the middle. Okay, and the Philistines are on one hill and the Israelites are on the other. Okay, this is the battle setup, and they're kind of encamped. They're set up to stay there for quite some time. Okay, so Saul's kingdom was marked by constant war with the Philistines, and as chapter 17 starts, here we are again. Philistines on one hill and the Israelites on the other. Now, they have a traditional spot. In Israel, you go to Israel, they've got a traditional spot for everything. Okay, so whether or not it's the actual spot is anybody's guess, but they have a traditional spot for everything. Every event in the Bible, they've got a spot. This is where it's traditionally believed that that's okay. You know, they didn't have pictures or the internet back then to really document anything, so it's anybody's guess whether it's actually the spot or not. But I mean, I think most of them are pretty accurate. And so we've been to that spot. We walked along the hills, or like, okay, I don't know if we were on the Israelite side or we were on the Israelites. We were on the Israelite side, of course. So you know, the Philistines are over there, and it's a fairly large field in between, so that you can imagine that there could be an army here in this. You know, and it's forested. You know, there's trees, so it's not like you're exposed. So you have the Philistines on one hill, and you've got the Israelites on the other. Okay, and so the Philistines have a guy, a champion. I'm in verse 4 now. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So his shield bearer would be like the armor bearer that David was for Saul. Okay, so where am I here? The Philistines, the P's, that's the Philistines. The Philistines have a champion, Goliath, okay, who is quite large and wants to make Israel an offer they can't refuse. But incredibly, they do anyway. We find out later that this is going on for 40 days. And here's the offer. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Okay. So, Deb, would you check my camera back there? Edwin is bouncing it, so I'm just. Otherwise, you know, these are videotaped, and so suddenly it goes off to the left. You'll understand why. So he makes him this offer. Now, this is probably the fact that he's got to explain it suggests that this is not a normal thing. Okay, so he's got to say, okay, here's what I got. This plan. Here's what we're going to do, and instead of all of us getting up to fight, I'm going to fight, and you guys send your one guy, and if our one guy wins, if your guy beats me, then we'll all give up, and if I beat you, then you give up. Seems like a reasonable idea. Now, looking at Goliath, we started talking about some of the textual problems, and there's a couple of different ways. So he's somewhere, depending on which translation or which manuscript basis, he's somewhere between 7 foot 9 inches tall and 9 foot 9 inches tall. Okay. just depending on one text, one manuscript says he's 4 cubits in a span, and another one says he's 6 cubits in a span. And depending on how big the span is, I suppose. Of course, if he's a big guy, and you ever seen, like, I don't know, he's a big guy. Okay, he's a big guy. Let's just leave it at that. The exact details as far as how big he was, he's much bigger than anyone in the Israelite camp, with the possible exception of Saul. Remember Saul? Head above everyone else. Who's the biggest person in the Israelite camp? Saul. So if the Philistines choose their biggest person, and the Israelites were going to pick their biggest person, who would they send? Saul. Okay? Doesn't happen here. So the Philistines have a champion. He's quite large and wants to make Israel an offer that they can't refuse. Makes perfect sense, but they do anyway. All right? Now, starting with this verse here, we have two semi-related issues with the story. Okay, two semi-related issues with story. There's a timeline problem here, and I've kind of alluded to that already. Okay, because the chapter 16, where David is introduced to Saul, and chapter 17, where David defeats Goliath, and is introduced to Saul, both seem to end with David meeting Saul for the first time. I mean, you read it, it's like, oh yeah, both times he's like, oh, great to meet you, which is kind of just like, wait, how does that work? Well, related to that, there's a textual problem with this story, with the story of David and Goliath. Now, for those of you who were here when we first started this, I said that our Old Testament is basically based on four sources. Okay, there is the Septuagint, okay, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it was done around 200 BC, and it was done, or 200 BC. The Vulgate was later. It was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. This was the Bible of the New Testament church. So when Paul is traveling, and when Peter and all of those guys are traveling, the Bible they're using is the Septuagint. It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay? And then we have the Masoretic text. Now, the Masoretic text is when people look at the Old Testament and they say, this is the text of the Old Testament, they say, okay, that's it. We put it together, and it's the Masoretic text. And that dates from about 800 AD. I know, you think, wait a minute. That's a long time afterwards. Now, we also have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then the fourth thing would be various other manuscripts, but there are not a lot of them. Okay, it's the Masoretic text, that's the Old Testament, and the Septuagint. So the Masoretic text and the Septuagint are the two main things. So if you look in your Bible, if you see any textual notes, especially if you have an NIV, it'll say LXX, which is the Septuagint 70, LXX 70, or MT for Masoretic text. Okay, so it's always a combination between those two. Now the thing is, everybody realizes that both the Septuagint and the Masoretic text are based on previous sources. Neither one of them are original. Now the problem is that the Septuagint has a much shorter story of David and Goliath than the Masoretic text does. A much shorter story. I know, you're thinking, how much shorter? Well, I'll show you. This on your left here, your left, yeah, okay. This is the Septuagint. Okay. Now the Masoretic text is what is translated in your Bible, generally speaking. Okay. So this is the NIV over here. Okay, so this is the Masoretic text. This is the NIV. So, okay, so here we are. These are the first 11 verses of the story. Okay, then we go over to the next, starting with verse 12. 12 through 31 is not in the Septuagint at all. The 200, the one that was done in 200. Okay, then you kind of go back and you see. This is where it starts picking up again, starting with verse 32. They match up. You have that story. And then there's a couple of other things, a couple of other smaller verses. And then the very end, where Saul meets David again, that's not in the Septuagint. It is in the Masoretic text. Okay, so kind of like if you, here, I'm going to just pass this around. You've seen this already. If you want to look at it. So if you, kind of like with the Gospel of Mark, has anybody done a study of the Gospel of Mark, and you have the longer ending of Mark? And so you have to ask yourself, okay, why is there this huge difference? Because if you read the Septuagint story, the Septuagint version of the David and Goliath story, you don't have the timeline problem, because it doesn't say that David just met him for the first time. Okay, so somewhere between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, somebody found this other story and put it in. Why? Don't know. I know you thought you were going to get an answer to this question. I don't know. Okay, so and there's all kinds of. This is one of the fun little things about the when you start talking about David and Goliath and Old Testament scholars, you start getting into this. Okay, are you a Masoretic text guy or are you a Septuagint guy? Kind of thing. And there's all kinds of writing as far as why the Septuagint is the right, or why the Masoretic text is the correct. Some have suggested that it's intentional, that they were two separate stories going around, and somebody just said, well, it fits, it puts together, we can put it together, and so let's do it. Let's add it together. And it's that could be okay, but it's still without, when you just use the Masoretic text, you have this timeline problem. With the Septuagint text, you still have the problem. It's like, okay, why did they add this? Okay, so most scholars that are looking at the Bible and looking at translations believe the Masoretic text is accurate. Okay, hence your Bible. If you have an NIV, you look at your Bible has the translation of the Masoretic text. And if you have a study Bible, you probably have a note in there to the effect that there's a lot of verses that are missing out of this. Okay, so nobody has printed a Bible other than a Septuagint translation, which you can get. Other than a Septuagint, nobody has printed a Bible yet where they just completely block out those verses. But it is one of the things that you're like, oh, okay, well, why do they? And if you go really super hard on inerrancy, if you go, oh well, everything's got to line up, then you've got to go through some really serious, and we'll do that, to kind of justify, okay, how can these both be right? How can David have been introduced to Saul twice, and Saul, who watched him play the harp, he was that close to him, made him an armor bearer, helping him put the armor on. That's pretty close. How could Saul not recognize him or not know who he is in David when he fights Goliath? Or if you switch him around, say that David and Goliath happened before. How could Saul, who dealt with his kid in this moment, put his armor on him? Was that close? Talk to him. Doesn't know who he was when he comes to putting the story later. Okay, I don't know. Okay, there isn't a, you can look at it and say, well, it's kind of, this could have happened here, this could have happened later, but the author chose to put them in this particular order. I'm sorry, did you?
Yeah, no, I feel like it's more likely that David was young when he was facing Goliath, and so he might have looked a lot younger.
That is one way to explain it, yes.
And so he didn't recognize him later. He went back to the sheep and...
Yes. Hold that thought. That is one way that there, and you could say that Saul's mental abilities weren't that great, because we know that he's got an evil spirit coming and going and all of that, and whether he was all there or not is another way to explain it. Okay, but hold that thought there. Now there is a third problem, and the only reason I put it here is because I could get a third T. Because I thought, I know there is a third, but I see there is a third problem, but we'll deal with that one later. Just that third T, I just couldn't relate. Although it has nothing to do with the third T, it's just T is third, and we'll move on to that. So in chapter 17 here, so David is reintroduced here to the story. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse. Do we already know that? Yeah, we already know that. Okay. Who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Side note, I don't make a note of it here, but in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, it's noted that David is Jesse's 7th son. Very clearly. It says Jesse's 7th son is David. Where Samuel says he had 7 sons and went looking for David, who was the 8th. That's one way to look at it. One died, was earlier, 7 sons at the time. But I'm just pointing out that there are these things here. It's like, if, how do they look at it? If a person had a son and that son has passed away, you don't typically say, well, I don't have any sons. Well, I had 1 son, but he's passed away. Or maybe at this point in the writing of just how many were alive, we don't know. Again, the historicity of this, the level of exactitude required of an Old Testament historian is not the level of exactitude that we expect today in writing. Okay, so again, they're just, yeah, it's 7 sons at the time. David was the 7th. One of the earlier 7 before him died. We don't know which one. Okay, one of the 7 died. Or another way to look at it is that one of the 7 before David, where David was the 8th, is a half brother. So they're only talking about real brothers, or full, same mother, same father, kind of thing. Okay, so again, that's one of the ways you can look. So there's a couple of different ways to look at it. I'm just throwing it out there because here it makes clear about which son he was. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The first one was Eliab. We're going to hear from him again. The second was Abinadab, and the third was Shema. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Okay, so David went back and forth from Saul, not from his brothers, from Saul. Now, why would David be going back and forth from Saul? Well, because he's got a job playing the lyre. Okay, now you could say that Saul is the battle, but the previous chapter has David working very closely with Saul, and it would make sense that, tomorrow's a full moon, and full moons are never good with the king, so make sure David is back here. Then he's got to go and do this. Somebody's got to watch the sheep. Okay, and so David is reintroduced to the readers, son of Jesse, his 8 sons. And 17:15 suggests that David is working with or for Saul at this point, which raises the problem of saying, well, David was much younger, and now a lot of years have elapsed. Okay, well, why is he going back and forth from Saul? Okay, so where am I here? So it's working with Saul. So David is sent. Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. Okay, so David is sent to bring some food to his brothers. Okay, he's like, this is how they supply the army. And when he say bring back some assurance, okay, there's a couple of different ways you can understand that. You could look at it and say, well, this is tell us how the battle's going. Okay, assurance that God is going to win this battle. Okay, that's one way to look. Another way that the word can be used is payment. That, hey, I have to pay people to do the work in the field that my 3 oldest sons would have done, and they're supposed to be getting paid because they don't fight for free, so go get the payment. So some reason why he needed to go and bring back this assurance. Bring back some good news, good news in the form of cash, gold, ducats, shekels, whatever they were using at that point. Okay. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd. Interesting. He didn't just abandon the flock. We always see these kind of references to David as the good shepherd. So as he leaves the flock, he makes sure somebody else is watching the flock. Okay. He left the flock in the care of the shepherd and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. Interesting contrast here. This is the keeper of the supplies or the baggage. The last time we heard about baggage is that's where Saul was hiding when he didn't want to make this public thing about his being king. Where's Saul? He's in the baggage. David's like, here, take my stuff. I'm going to the battle. So again, you always have this contrast between David and Saul, especially when they're, together or, both alive at the same time. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now, granted, he's hard to miss, right? He's a big guy, and they're all. So they came down from the hills. They come to the, they kind of, and as I recall, there's like a creek going through the middle, and so they come in, and then Goliath would come out, and this has been going on for quite some time. So David is sent to bring food to his brothers and gain assurance or money. David is appalled at Goliath's effect on the Israelites. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. The appalling comes a little bit later. Kind of jumped ahead there. Now the Israelites had been saying, okay, so David is there talking, the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. Okay, so starting with 17, I'm sorry, wrong part. Rumor has it, verse 25 here, that whoever kills Goliath will be rewarded with great wealth, the king's daughter, and a family tax exemption. Not a bad deal. Okay, that was exactly the deal I got when I married Debbie. Okay, except for the part about great wealth, the family tax exemption. But she did marry me. We were at a family wedding yesterday, so her brother's son. So now my son, my younger son, is now the last single Slobodian. Just saying, he's taken this with great honor. He plans to bring great achievement to that. And he was my nephew was 40, is 40. So Silas has a long way to go before he beats him, but he's got a goal in mind now. But regardless, so he gets these great wealth, the king's daughter, and a family tax exemption. Of course, with Debbie comes great wealth, right? And she is a jewel in herself. Okay, no tax exemption. No, that never came. But be that as it may. So he's hearing this, and I kind of get this idea that this is being talked about. If somebody's saying this or somebody's talking, and David overhears it. This is how it kind of feels. Because the text says this is what they're talking about. Then David, like, I want to make sure here. Let me just make sure. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Okay, so you can imagine the scene. Now, David here is the youngest. He's the youngest of the family. Okay, although I don't think he's not like a boy. Okay, he's probably a grown man. I would say like 20-ish. This is my thinking, just based on everything we're going to say, and the timeline and what he's doing. He's out there, watching the sheep and all of that stuff. Okay, so this is not something you would send a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old out. So I mean, when you see the stories of David and Goliath, and you have this little boy, it's like, no, it's not. He was probably at least 18, 19, 20. It's my opinion. You can disagree with me if you want. But he says, so he kind of checks it out. This confirms it. What are they going to do? You ever hear something and you want to find out if it's true, but you don't want to, how do I figure this out without, but he does. What's going to happen? they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for him who kills him. Okay, so David is appalled. Rumor has it. David asks and find out that it's all true. To David, Goliath is just an uncircumcised Philistine who defies the armies of the Lord God. Okay, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the Lord God? Okay, now this is a new guy, even though he's not. Again, I don't think he's small, but he's not in armor. We know that. He's probably dressed like a shepherd. These guys have been there for 40 days listening to this guy. This battle, this war has been going on for quite some time. And suddenly this guy dressed like a shepherd comes walking in and goes, hey, what's the problem here? Hey, he's just an uncircumcised Philistine. What's the problem here? Okay. Well, this doesn't go over well with David's brothers, especially the oldest. Okay. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Well, yeah, he did come to watch the battle. He raced up to see how the battle is going. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is, what does Eliab know that most of the rest of the Israelites don't? He knows that David was anointed king. Okay. Now, maybe it didn't go over well with him. If you find out that your youngest brother is the one that's going to be anointed king, what was wrong with me? I don't, And again, we talked about this earlier that, in the Bible you have this, the oldest gets the good stuff and everyone else kind of gets what's left over. And yet, more times than not in the Bible, it's somebody else besides the oldest. That here's the rule, and it's like forever being broken. Okay, just forever being broken. But Eliab, maybe he's not happy about this. Maybe he's like, he doesn't think it's legit. I don't know, whatever. Eliab is not really in the true David supporter mode right here. Okay, he's like, just get out of it. You're making us look bad. Okay. David said, I'm sorry. Then verse 29. Now what have I done? Said David. Can I even speak? It's like, this is why I don't think he's just a little boy. Again, if you remember the King James, if I grew up with the King James version, this in the King James translates this, is there not a cause? I just remember that because there was a sermon I heard once upon a long ago. And the title was, is there not a cause? Based on that phrase. Again, I don't remember any of the lessons from any of the sermons I heard, but I remember all their titles, kind of things. I'm kidding here. It says, can I even speak? Right? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. Okay? So David is like, he's not letting this go. His oldest brother has confronted him and says, hey, cut it out. Leave. You're just causing trouble. You're making us look bad. Go away. David's like, hey, what? I've got as much right to be here as you, and turns and talks to the next guy. How come nobody's fighting him? How come nobody's fighting this guy? How come nobody's fighting this guy? Okay? Like, don't you understand? It's like, we got the Lord on our side. What's he got? Okay? And so, says what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Okay? Now we go back to where the Septuagint and the Masoretic text match up. All of that stuff I just talked about from the moment that David is introduced to now is not in the Septuagint version of the story. Now we're back to the Septuagint version where they match up, Septuagint and the Masoretic, just for what it's worth. David said to Saul, let's see, where am I? What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David's words make it back to Saul, who calls for him. Wait, go get that guy. Okay, go get that guy. So David and Saul meet. As a question mark. Is this the first time they've met? I don't know. It's just one of them happened first, And there's advantages for saying that the meeting takes place, that the David and Goliath takes place before before the playing the lyre. Others says it's better if the other. We know that the author puts them in this order for a reason. Just he points out that David is musical. David is a great guy, and now we're going to show this great military prowess he has. But David walks in, and David opens the conversation, right? So David is this shepherd walking up to the king and going to tell the king what needs to be done. Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. So David literally walks in and solves Saul's problem, sort of. So he says, I'll go out there. I'll go out there. Saul replied, let's see, where am I? I'm on the second page. David and Solomon meet to discuss the whole Goliath problem. David starts by solving Saul's problem. And I have a couple of popular verses there. Isaiah 6:8, look for who will I send, who will go for me? Here am I, Lord, send me. I look for man to stand in the gap. Perhaps such a time as this, kind of, all these different verses you can use here. Saul says, I'll go. Or David, I'm going to get to it eventually. David says, I'll do it. Let me out there. Let me at him. I'll go get him. Okay. Saul has a couple of reasonable objections. Okay. Saul has a couple of reasonable objections. He says, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth. Okay. Hey, you're young. Okay. You're young. He's been doing this his whole life. Okay. And the fact that Saul is looking at him saying he's young, again, doesn't mean he's a 6-year-old. Doesn't mean he's a little boy. Okay. As some of us get older, the definition of young expands. My nephew who got married yesterday, to me, young. That's 40s, 20s. He's not old. Okay. But whatever. You're a young man. This guy's been doing it his whole life. This guy's a battle-hardened veteran. He's 8 to 9 feet tall. He's huge. You're a shepherd. Okay? This is not, just Saul is being very reasonable here. Right? I mean, he's not, there's no, I don't think, and maybe if Saul knows him, maybe he's like, that's another reason. I don't want to lose you. That we don't read about. But so he's very reasonable objections here. So then David gives him his qualifications. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Okay? This is not something that a small child would be doing. Okay? We'll forget about just the whole upper body strength kind of, thing. So, I mean, this is he's relatively large. David is, as far as a person. I went after it, struck it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the paw of this Philistine. It's the same word. Okay. So I mean, the translators, I think it's better because it's the same word. Paw of the lion, paw of the bear, paw of the Philistine. David is like, they got God on our side. Okay? I mean, you think about it, and I may be getting ahead of myself here. In the history of the Philistines and the Israelites, what possibly could they think back to as being a reason to suggest that the God of Israel is more powerful than the God of the Philistines? Anybody remember any stories earlier? Like maybe 4 through 6, the Ark narrative? What happened when the Ark of the Covenant ended up in the Philistine temple? The Philistines were, the God fell and fell again, and then they had to get rid of it, and there were tumors and all that kind of stuff. Hey, we got to, and they were like, get it out of here. Get it out of here. Okay? Apparently that doesn't come up. Should have, but at least not to anyone else but David.
So is this directly, ultimately, a question of faith? Because any of those Israeli soldiers, Hebrew soldiers, with any modicum of true faith, because you don't hear like he's insulted the army of the Lord God. You know, it's like you don't hear anybody else talk.
Right.
So, but in reality, if there was any soldier, Hebrew could have beat Goliath because he was a soldier. The living
Well,
God.
I'm getting ahead of myself, but the thing is, David doesn't defeat Goliath. The Lord defeats
Yeah.
Goliath. So the Lord could have used any one of those soldiers to defeat Goliath. Okay. But he uses David. And David knows it. David knows that the Lord and him, you know, me and the Lord are a majority. Have you ever seen that bumper sticker or whatever kind of thing? David knows that with the Lord on my side, hey, and you see this as we approach the actual battle. Yes.
And remember, he's filled with the Holy Spirit because he's already been anointed.
David is.
David
Yes.
is.
Yeah. Yeah. Which the others not necessarily would have been. So your servant has killed both. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the paw of this Philistine. Saul said to David, "Go, the Lord be with you." Now it's interesting, but there's one last thing here. Saul dresses David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. This is kind of an interesting, again, if you put 17 after 16, this is Saul doing for David what David does for Saul. Okay. Others have looked at this, and there's something there's a symbolic view to this as well. That whereas Samuel gives David the theological kingdom, the spiritual kingdom, this is Saul giving him the military. Here, you are in the king's armor. I am giving you the king's armor to make this fight. Okay, again, it's interesting. I mean, you can't really prove it from the text, but it's kind of an interesting picture that here. And if you think about it, because he's the king, right? And so you'd think it'd be kind of distinctive. There's a story later where, later in the Old Testament, where one of the king wants to switch armor with somebody because they'll say if they see me, they'll know I'm the king. So if David puts on Saul's armor and walks out, who are most of the people going to think is fighting Saul or fighting Goliath? Saul. Okay, they'll figure it out eventually. But the immediate thing is like, oh, that's Saul's armor. Head's covered, you know. That's Saul's armor going out there. Nobody's going to think there's somebody else in there. So David tries it on, right? Puts it on his head. He kind of walks around for it. And he says, no. Okay. That's for David. I'm sorry. David sees something symbolic happening here. Okay. David tries and refuses. Then he picks up 5 stones and a staff and leaves. And this is when we were in Israel. This is when I said I forgot my stones. When we were in Israel, the only stones that I picked up and kept were stones from this river. So I have a stone. Debbie has one too from this actual river that would have been right next to where David could have been. You know, right next to where David picked it up. Okay, there were people that were picking up rocks everywhere, but that was just the only place that I picked up a rock from and kept it was from there. So he picks up these 5 rocks, just him, 5 rocks, and a staff, and he goes in to see. He starts approaching. Okay, he says he tries walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. Okay, so he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with the sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Kind of went, I can't do this. I'm just going to take my rocks and a stick, and off I go. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with a shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health. This is the second time that David has been described as glowing with health, which I just think is an interesting. I don't think anybody has ever accused me of glowing with health kind of thing. I don't, maybe you are, but I don't. Glowing with health, okay, and handsome, and he despised him. I think is kind of an interesting. This, is he better looking than me? Is he? Is it? I mean, it's kind of an insult, that you send this little kid. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Okay. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. So for David and Goliath, both, this is a spiritual battle. Okay, for both of them. This is a battle of the gods. And this is how they would look at it at this point. And we've talked about this before, that when one army beats another army, the assumption is that this army's God beats that army's God. But David and Goliath are making it very clear. Goliath comes out and says, my gods are cursing you and they're going to give me the power. And David's like, no, my God is going to give me the power to take care of you. Okay. He says, as the Philistine moved closer, David was quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone. It's interesting because Goliath's battle, he had to be close, right? Because he's got a shield and he's got a stick and or a spear and all that. So it's kind of close quarters sort of battling. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down onto the ground. Okay, so the first stone, one shot, hits him in the forehead. Okay, and David, using a stone and a sling, strikes Goliath in the head, and he goes down. And I say he goes down because there are some that look at this and say the way it could be translated is that the first stone knocks him out, that the word there says that he killed him really can be used to say knocks him out. And then the cutting off the head, that's hard to recover from. Okay. Stone to the head, maybe. Cutting off, decapitation, not so easy. Okay. And again, I put it in there in a double tap moment. For those who have seen Zombieland, okay, David cuts off his head, and he is really, really, really dead at this point. Okay. So again, this is something he grabs Goliath's sword, which is going to come back into the narrative later on. He grabs Goliath's sword, pulls it out, cuts off Goliath's head. This is in front of everybody sees this going on. Okay, and you think this is to me is like just a fascinating story that David comes in, and it's a great story. Don't get me wrong, but it isn't that David didn't beat Goliath. God did. Okay. And again, we like to use it as it's a metaphor. Oh, it's a David and Goliath, where the small guy wins. Okay. The God of the small guy won. Okay. There's no reason why David should have won this battle. Okay. No reason whatsoever. This is like a really bad idea. Just like Jonathan's plan in chapter 14 was a really bad idea. Okay. But Jonathan went in faith and David went in faith. And both of these two stories, you have these two young guys who saw that they had an opportunity in faith to attack the Philistines and went for it. Okay, and both times God won. Okay, so what is the lesson of David and Goliath? The lesson of David and Goliath is that God won. Okay, it's not that we should pick up 5 stones for the 5 battles in our life and all of that kind of stuff. That's spiritualizing the text. Okay, we do it. How many have been in that sermon? You know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, the story is God won. What does this tell us about God? It tells us that God won. Okay, and he says, so David triumphed over this Philistine and stoned with a sword in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with a sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran as they have done before. Okay, and I think I have the text there. David takes, in a double tap moment, David cuts off the head, and Goliath is really dead. Then they, like they have done before in chapter 7 and chapter 14, the Philistines run. Okay, the last time we hear they ran was after Jonathan's battle of faith. Okay, David takes Goliath, it says, after he killed him, he cut off his head. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. The dead were strewn along the Sharon road to Gath and Ekron. When the Philistines returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. Okay, now there's a couple of questions here. Why does he take the head to Jerusalem? No idea. Jerusalem is not under Israelite control at this point. Why does he take it to Jerusalem? I don't know. Text doesn't tell us. Now, it could be that this is looking back, and ultimately he takes the head to Jerusalem so that when he does make Jerusalem his capital, Goliath's head is rolling around there somewhere. And you think, that's really crazy? Go home and Google Oliver Cromwell's head. Okay? Oliver Cromwell, killed, head cut off, not buried until 1960. Oliver Cromwell died in like 1659, something like that. He was the head of the English Civil War, killed him. Literally, his head was wandering around on display until 1960. Google it. I dare you. See a picture of Oliver Cromwell's head, dead for 300 years. Okay, so could he have done it? Yeah, certainly. Why not? Okay, I mean, there was the Munster Rebellion in the early 15th century. The three leaders of the Munster Rebellion were put in cages and hung on the side of a church, and the cages are still there. Now the bodies are not there because 400 years, there's a lot of birds and stuff, but the cages are still there. Okay, so is it that unusual? Probably not. His own tent, does he have a tent there? Apparently. Okay, or is it the baggage tent? Does he take the sword back somewhere? Ultimately, the sword makes it to the temple. We know that. Okay, so real quick, they're dead. When the Israelites returned, David took the Philistines' head. Verse 55 and following, we're back to the part where we don't know. I'm sorry, it's not in the Septuagint version. It's a flashback. Okay, verse 55, as Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of who's his cousin, by the way, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Now, wait a minute. He's sending messages to Jesse, saying, send us David, even though we know he's a sheep. How is this? Okay, so again, maybe there's an age difference. That's one way. Maybe the mental abilities of Saul are not. Maybe David has changed that much. Maybe it's the fact that he sees David in a different location. Okay, so you have that location difference. Like you see somebody, you ever see somebody that you usually see in a uniform. Okay, and it takes you a while to. Debbie and I were walking down the Riverwalk in Chicago earlier this summer. Okay, anybody been to the Riverwalk in Chicago? Okay, we're walking down the Riverwalk in Chicago, just bouncing along. We're going to do this. We turn the corner, and voila, there's Pastor Jared. Took a minute. Wait a minute. This is not where I usually see you. This is not where I was expecting to see you. And if you ever know somebody who's like you usually see like in a uniform, like a police officer, and then you see them in civilian clothes at the movie theater, and it takes you a while to realize, who is that guy? I know him. And you realize you sat next to him for a year or something like that. Because it's a different, maybe that's what it is. Okay, I don't know. Okay, there isn't an easy, clear, clean answer. But at one point, these were two separate stories floating around, and somebody put them together. So he says, who is that man? As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know. It's interesting because of the way he puts that. Because, as long as he's living, as soon as you're not living, then that guy is, sorry. The king said, find out whose son this young man is. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. So there's David standing there. Again, now he's not used to seeing David holding a guy's head. Okay, now you don't see this much anymore. If you go to a lot of Shakespeare plays, you do. There's always a way to get a head, carrying a head in on something like that. He says, whose son are you, young man? David says, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. How does he not know who he is? No matter which one you put to, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But again, it's one of these things. It's either it's a literary device by the writer to make you introduce him to you twice, which is as likely as any. There's an age difference. It's just the right place, wrong time. It's the mental capabilities of Saul. Regardless, we don't really know any one of those could explain it, or maybe it's a combination of all four. All right. The last thing, and I'll let you go. I'm sorry for going a little longer today, but it's we're not having ABF next week or the week after that, so I didn't want to leave this hanging. So forgive me for blasting through this. The third problem that I talked about is in another passage in 2 Samuel 21. It mentions the Hebrew says that Ethanon, son of Jerry-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite. So there are some who have looked at that and said, no, wait a minute, this whole story is made up. This guy Elhanan is the one that killed Goliath. Okay, not David. They just put David into the story. This was a creation myth created to make David the king. Okay, there are people that would make that particular argument. However, there's a couple of passages here in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, in another battle with the Philistines, Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lami, the brother of Goliath, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. So there is that same descriptive element in there that said, so perhaps something's missing. Most scholars believe that 2 Samuel 21 has a transcription error. And in fact, if you read the NIV just translates it, the brother of Goliath. The Hebrew doesn't say the brother of Goliath. And so that's another example, and this is one of my side things that I keep pointing out, how much decision-making goes into your translations, whatever translation you use, even without any notes whatsoever, okay? Because the Hebrew does not say the brother of Goliath, okay? The Masoretic text as we have it now, okay? But at one point, most scholars believe that it did. So it's not really a serious objection. It's one of those that if somebody's just kind of looking for the little nickel and dime sort of thing. So, all right, well, thank you very much.